What in the Law podcast is back. Mike Harris here, and today I have a respectable show because I found a respectable guest. Local attorney, former head of public defender's office in the south of Colorado, private attorney, current mediator, and local legend, Kent Gray. Why don't you start out by telling him a little bit more about your past and what brought you from a law student to the successful and, frankly, for a lot of us locals, legendary career you've had?
Well, I don't know about legendary, but I started out, my undergrad degree was at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, and I studied criminal justice because I thought that would be a good generic enough degree to have to try and apply for law school, if that's what I wanted to do. So then I moved out to Colorado in 1978 and became a resident first, and then applied for law school at CU, which is Colorado University in Boulder, and I was accepted. And so went to law school there. While I was there, I was able to participate in a program called Legal Aid, which is where students were asked to help out various people who didn't have a lot of money to help them with various things. I did criminal defense, minor kind of cases. And then from there, I did that for 1 year during law school, my second year. And then my third year, I became what was called a student public defender. And student public defenders were still students, as the name implies. But we were able to practice in Colorado. They have a thing called the Student Practice Act under the supervision of an actual lawyer. Or in this case, a public defender. And I was able to do that for a year while I was in law school. Got a couple of jury trials under my belt doing that. And then was hired to come down to Colorado Springs to be a public defender. And so I got down here in 1982.
And how did you go from your early part of your career as a public defender or deputy public defender, kind of, I guess that's basically the lawyer on the feet on the ground in court type of job, basically, right?
Yeah, the system is set up that there's one person who's appointed. He is the public defender for the state of Colorado. Then everybody else are deputy state public defenders. Whether you're a supervisor or whether you're a lawyer going into court, you're called the deputy state public defender.
So how did you go from that to being in charge of one district, but I like to say multiple counties? How did that work?
Yeah, so I had been a public defender for about 6 years at the time, and I was asked by one of the chief deputy state public defenders if I would be willing to go down to La Junta and run the office there. So when you run an office, your title is an office head, and that's it. You're still just a deputy state public defender. And I did that for almost a year, and then came back to Colorado Springs and rejoined the Office of Public Defender here. And then I stayed there until the end of 96 when I went out in private practice.
Why'd you do that?
Well, two reasons. One, my wife, who was also, we had met as public defenders, but she had been in private practice. She got appointed as a judge. And so to avoid conflicts in her courtroom, I couldn't remain a public defender anymore. So it was a good time to go into private practice. Plus, I was able to move into her office when she moved over to the courthouse.
So what is it like going from public defender to being a private attorney? And what is that kind of differences in life like?
Well, again, in Colorado, it's different than a lot of places because that year, starting January 1, 1997, Colorado adopted a second criminal defense organization called the Alternate Defense Council. And that's where you got appointed to be on a case when the public defender had a conflict and couldn't represent somebody. So, for instance, if Mike and I had gone out and did a bank robbery together, they could have only represented one of us. And the other one of us, if we qualified, would have been appointed an Alternate Defense Council.
You weren't supposed to talk about that bank robbery. No, but for example,
I thought we got away with it.
Oh, well, no one's watching this, right? No police, hopefully. Well, maybe they are. Maybe we should edit this part.
It was an example. We're okay.
Yeah. Anyways, well, what would you say to someone who is thinking about becoming a lawyer or is a new lawyer looking for work? What kind of differences are there between going to work for the public defender versus going private?
Well, as I never went and worked with a private law firm, I can talk about the differences, but not from my own experience, from observing them. A lot of people will start out of law school or actually still in law school working for a bigger private law firm, and they may do a big variety of different kinds of cases. And sometimes they still have a portion that does criminal defense. So if that was really your interest in criminal defense, then you would be able to still do that. The nice thing about the public defender is you really have to kind of be dedicated to the cause of representing people who are charged with crimes but can't afford to hire their own lawyer.
One thing that I sometimes come across is you have a client or a potential client who doesn't have a lot of money and they qualify to get a public defender, but they have family who is at least able, maybe they're middle class or maybe they're wealthy or maybe they're just barely have enough to make it, but they can afford to get a private attorney and they have to decide, is it worth doing that? What type of considerations would you say to someone about that decision?
Well, I think it really depends. When I first became a public defender, it was a smaller office. There was only 10 lawyers. And the nice thing about the public defender system is it's a statewide system in Colorado. So we got a lot of training, both on the state level and on the local level. So you were really getting a lawyer who had all the same experience pretty much as a private attorney, but you weren't having to pay them lots of money. Now, there's so many public defenders, I'm not sure they have quite the same amount of hands-on supervision and training. So it's a little questionable. It really depends, again, and I think, Mike, you've talked on other podcasts about, what are your charges, and is there somebody that specializes in those kind of charges? And would that be somebody that you would want to get versus a public defender who may do some of those charges? Because as a public defender, you do all the criminal charges, but is a little more specialized. And so that would be a consideration for sure.
And it seems like there can be some big differences between county court or misdemeanor court and sometimes the major felonies as to who you might be getting, not to mention just geography. What can you say about that a little bit?
Well, on the major crimes, most people, even if they are upper middle class, can't afford an attorney on those because attorneys have to charge a lot of money on those cases. Because an attorney would have to hire support. They'll have their own office, overhead, secretaries, maybe get an investigator on the case. So there's a lot there. Whereas through the public defender's office, they have those built in. They have paralegals, they have secretaries, they have built-in investigators. And so they're able to help you investigate and prepare your case oftentimes better than a private attorney can.
Is it kind of different sometimes on the more minor, relatively speaking minor? It's always major to the person facing the charge, right, who maybe has a misdemeanor or a traffic kind of case.
And I would say, again, it depends on the case because a DUI case, a driving under the influence of alcohol, which is what we call it here in Colorado, is actually a very technical type of charge. There's a lot of science involved. There's over and above the persuasive abilities of the lawyer themselves. So it sometimes pays to hire somebody who specializes in those kind of cases, even though on paper they're not that serious. But we know DUIs have a lot of lasting repercussions to people. So,
and what would you say to maybe someone who is looking for that first job? Is it a good idea to start out by yourself, or is it usually kind of a more common thing to go work for a bigger organization like a public defender or something like that?
Well, I've seen people that end up in the criminal defense community that have done both. And I think clearly people who have come through the public defender's office or like a district attorney's office, a prosecutor's office, have gotten more experience, more.
What would you say to someone who is thinking about becoming an attorney and he was considering going private or working for a public defender's office, district attorney's office, or some other type of big organization. What type of differences are there in becoming a lawyer?
Well, I think that somebody who's just going out and what they call in the trade is hanging in a shingle, meaning they're opening up their own law practice without any association with a bigger law firm or a group. They have a very difficult time because they don't have much resources. They're still going to have overhead. They're going to have trouble building up a client base, which is something you never have a shortage of when you're a public defender, because you get lots of clients. And so you get more training, you get more, there's more people there to bounce ideas off of, to question when you're in a bigger organization like a public defender's office or a district attorney's office, or even a large private law firm that has people who have worked in that same area they're interested in.
Have you seen some changes in the practice? Not so much just in the laws on the books, but just in the way the practice works in court and in society since you started out towards now?
Quite a bit of difference. When I first started, the things were much more amicable between the prosecutor's office and the defense bar. That they were able to talk, meet, have a beer after work and still talk about cases and things, and nobody took it personally. Now it's become really impersonal, and you have district attorneys, deputy district attorneys who are in court being told what they can and can't do on a case. They can't really evaluate it by themselves and put in their analysis, and so it's tougher for, I think, for prosecutors, and lot fewer cases actually get worked out to everybody's satisfaction because of that. Defense attorney, I liken it to being a prosecutor or a defense attorney. A prosecutor is like somebody who works on a car assembly line. They're handed all the pieces, they just put it together. Whereas a criminal defense attorney is more like an architect. They have to come up with things that aren't necessarily in the facts and stuff like that to be able to get creative and do other things. So I enjoyed that part of being a defense attorney a lot more.
And have you done some non-criminal work more recently that you've moved into?
Not as a lawyer so much, but I've been doing mediations for the last 20 years. And in Colorado, and especially Colorado Springs, they have a program where almost all cases, whether they're civil, divorce, family law, they're ordered to go to mediation before they come to court and can have a trial. And so they had a mediation office, a statewide program called the Office of Dispute Resolution, and I worked with them for about 18 years.
So for someone who maybe is not familiar with the terms, what would that actually be? Like, what's like an example? Like if you had like a divorce or something, how would that work?
So mediation often gets confused with another term called arbitration. With a mediator, such as myself, I'm not there to decide your case for you. I'm there to try and help the parties reach decisions on things that they can both be happy with, and try to find for them some grounds to be able to move forward. If it's like a divorce case, that might be a matter of dividing up property, or splitting custody with children, or if it's just a custody case, it might be what kind of parenting plan are they going to work out, meaning parenting time for each person, what kind of child support is going to be ordered, things like that. And so as a mediator, I can help them work through those. When I first started mediation, almost, I would say at least 80% of all the divorce cases had attorneys. Now, though, it's probably almost flip-flopped, where maybe half of the cases at best have lawyers and the other half are just going on their own, or what we call pro se. And so they have a lot to have to learn and do, because a pro se person is held to the same legal standards in court as a lawyer is. So what kind of evidence they can present, things like that.
So I would imagine going into some of these divorce mediations that people often may want to talk about who was right or wrong in the breakup, and, argue about who was the good or bad spouse. And kind of get things like that off their chest. How does that actually work regarding kind of moral considerations and financial considerations when you're actually in court? And
so in Colorado, the judges are really required to put aside the kind of moral things and really work just on the actual facts of the case. If it's financial, how to divide that up. If it's children, how to divide up parenting time and responsibilities, things like that. So unless that moral or immoral conduct reflects on something else, it's not really going to be looked at by a judge. In fact, they'll cut people off and prevent them from getting into that. So some mediators have more an area of specialty, just like lawyers. So they might be able to, if you are trying to kick somebody out of the house, out of the rental property or things like that, they can help you mediate a case like that. Whereas if it's a family law case with a divorce or child custody, most all the mediators here in Colorado Springs anyways have good experience with that. So there's an organization in Colorado. The website is coloradomediation.org, where it's a statewide group of mediators that can join and be part of that. And that website will have various mediators in various areas and their qualifications and what kind of cases that they might be more specialized in being able to handle. So that can help out people too.
Now, one thing with the internet, there's so much information, and there's a lot of great information, but there's also a lot of disinformation or bad information. So anything you would tell people about what is a good place to go to look for help in understanding legal issues?
Well, to get their own lawyer would be the best if they can afford to do that. But otherwise, there's, like I said, there's the state's website, the self-help forms and that stuff. That's going to be information that you can rely on, because the courts will accept those pleadings, those paperworks that you're filing and stuff like that, because they'll tell you what form to put them in and how to do it correctly.
So are these basically kind of like pre-approved court forms that they like to see, the courts like to see?
Yes, they're in a format that the courts are used to and that they insist on using. So they'll be good in that. They're all approved by the courts if you keep it in that format.
And I think we should point out it's important to make sure you're in the right jurisdiction when you're doing that, right?
Yeah, and that's, that really depends on what kind of case you have.
So with all of this information on the internet and the forums, why do people need to hire lawyers at all?
Well, because there's a lot of issues that they can tell you the right form, but they can't tell you why you might need a special form or even a unique kind of pleading or form for your case. And there's a lot of tax consequences, other financial consequences that people on their own just aren't going to know about. And that's where a lawyer can help you out. Two parts.
So what kind of wrap up would you say to someone who is in the system has their own case, who maybe doesn't have a lawyer, or what consideration should they have about getting ready and whether or not they need to get a lawyer?
Well, certainly it's easy to get in over your head, especially if the other side has a lawyer, because that lawyer is going to know things that they can do or influence a judge that you're not going to be prepared for. If you're both without lawyers, it's at least more of even ground, but you want to get as much information as you can before you come to court and before you prepare your case.
And for someone who is a prospective or new lawyer, what would you tell them about how to kind of be prepared, how to get ready with their career and be ready for court?
I would say new lawyers, the more you can volunteer or do internships, things like that, the better prepared you'll be, because you'll get some of that training and experience and good advice from people that you're working with.
Well, this was very good. I thank you very much for coming on and helping to explain some things and give some different perspectives about what it's like in this business we call law. So thank you very much, Mr. Gray. We will have some links in the description sections, and I'll see you next time on What in the Law podcast.